This episode of Brains on Games will preview a cyberpunk-themed game about escaping to a floating city. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald, and this episode we are going to talk about a science fiction style cyberpunk kind of a game that's coming up on Kickstarter in April 2022. It's a game that came to me a couple of weeks ago from the designer, and it is a game called, you might hear pieces rattling here in the box, there it goes. It's a game called, I don't even know if you can see the whole box, this is very big. It's a game called Cytress. Now, Cytress is short for Cyberpunk Fortress. Cytress is a game that you can play with between 2 and 5 players, and it's for kids age 14 and up, and a game plays in about 20 minutes per player, so it's about 40 to 100 minutes to get through one of these games once you get used to it. Let's take a look at Cytress in a bit more detail. Cytress is a game that is medium in terms of its complexity, and you can see on the camera here I've set up the main board. This is the floating fortress, or the floating city of Stratos is its name, and the game is huge, so I'll have to find a picture to show you the whole board because you won't be able to see it on my little camera. But it is medium in terms of its complexity, and like I said, it's for kids age 14 and up. There are things like missions where you might be doing an assassination or abducting. One of the resources in the game is drugs, so it is a game that's more for the older crowd, not for younger kids. Even if they could understand the complexity, some of the themes are a little bit mature for them. What you're trying to do in this game is complete these missions that will allow you to access these tubes, build tubes and access them on this mini map so that you can bring your worker cubes, your gang members, up to this floating city in order to earn more prestige and influence. It is a victory point game, so you're trying to be the player with the most victory points. At the end, you start the game with 7 of these little I've got these 3D printed tubes here that came with the game. So you start with 7 of these per player, and when the last one is placed, that's going to be the last round of the game, and then you start to count up those prestige points or victory points. You earn those prestige points by using these tubes to get up to the city, by having majority control in the area on the mini map here around the tubes, by advancing your skills, and I'll show you what the player boards look like, and by hoarding supplies, really, is the other way that you can do it. You can also collect bounties that give you some victory points for each one that you collect. And it is a game with modular boards. So depending on the number of players, you're going to have these randomized mini-map pieces, and there are multiples so that with larger play counts, you get a bit of a bigger play area to work with. This is set up for a 2-player game, but with a 3-player game, you get a third piece that's added on here. You've also got these 4 places where you can go to complete these missions, and these fit together like puzzles too. The way that it's going to be set up is that you're going to have the Stratos board at the top, and then these other puzzle pieces kind of fit into slots with the mini-map in the center. You'll also have this underbelly board. This is another location you can visit. This goes at the very bottom, so the other pieces are slotted in above this place. You don't complete missions when you go here. Instead, you're trading resources. Maybe you're taking out a loan because you need some extra resources in a hurry to do something on your turn, or you're collecting bounties to earn some victory points. This game has a cyberpunk theme that might be reminiscent to some of Blade Runner, but what I thought about when I played was this old Matt Damon movie, I think it's almost 10 years old now, called Elysium, which is about a character who's trying to escape the Earth, which has been kind of ravaged, and he wants to get to the floating satellites where all of the rich people live because he needs some medical treatment. One of the main mechanisms in this game is worker placement. So I've put a board here. This is the resource tracking board that each player is going to have. It's not going to be in the middle of the table like this. It's going to be off to the side, outside of that city map, like I showed you earlier. And it allows you to track your resources with those little counters. But you've also got 3 ships and a leader standee on that board as well. So in the first phase of the game, you're collecting resources. Then there's the influence phase where you move your leader to one of 4 locations on the board in order to gather a particular kind of resource. And then the next phase is to move your ships around and visit these different locations, like I was talking about, the underbelly, to visit some loan sharks, or those other locations on that puzzle board, like I told you about, where you might complete missions that cost resources but give you some kind of bonus. Each of those locations will have a little deck of these missions that you're trying to complete by visiting them, and they're all color-coded and they match the colors on that location. And you're going to have 3 face-up missions that you can choose from when you go to visit those locations. They might be looting or abducting or a termination mission or some kind of sabotage. And I'll tell you what happens once you collect these missions, but they are involving a particular kind of activity, and it's involving a certain faction in the game. After a player completes a mission, they're going to place one of their little cubes. I think they have 15 of these cubes at the start of the game, somewhere on the mini map, on a hex that matches that color. So you can, as we played through the game with only 2 players in these little spaces, we could kind of block our opponent from being able to do a certain mission by trying to take up all of that color so that they couldn't place a worker there. You have to have a blank spot to place your cube on that map. You could also place your ship on the Stratos board, and that's what's going to allow you to get your cubes up from the mini-map into the floating city. And you do that by building these tubes. Now, these tubes are like little Lego blocks that fit together. They can be 1 high or 2 levels high or 3 levels high, corresponding to the different levels of the city. If I place my ship here at Stratos to build one of these tubes, I'm going to take a tube of whatever level, depending on what kind of resources I spent and how many I spent. I'm going to place it here on the mini map, and then I'm going to take the cube and move it up to the corresponding level of the board. And you're earning 5 victory points for level 1 at the end of the game, 10 for level 2, 15 for level 3. And then once you've placed those towers, you're also trying to have majority control around those towers on the mini map, because that earns you a bunch of victory points as well. I've moved the Stratos board out of the way so I can show you the player boards. So these player boards are going to be placed above your resource tracking board that I showed you earlier. And this is the Rebel that you're playing through the game. They're double-sided, so you can choose. You randomly get assigned one of these cards, and you can choose which side you want to use. But that's going to go right up here above, and there's a little bit of information about each of those characters that you're going to be playing. But that's the next part of the game. As you complete these missions, you're doing some engine building. So you're not just placing workers and cubes, ships and leaders and cubes on that map. You are also building up this engine that makes each of your actions more powerful. If I complete a mission, for example, from the yellow portion of the board, the corporocrats, I think they're called, I'm going to grab this mission and it gets slotted in over here so that the colors line up, and you're building a life path, they call it. So these cards are going to line up like this, and now each time I'm collecting resources at the beginning of the first phase of the game, instead of just getting one blue one, I'm going to get a blue one and a pink one. Each of these missions has an impact or improves your action in a different part of the game. So you can specialize in one area, you can spread things out so that your character is more well balanced. But it's so interesting that you've got this engine building mechanism, but your engine is really this rebel character that you're improving by completing these missions. He's becoming more and more powerful as you play the game, and his missions have a bigger and bigger impact while you're building up these cards. So you can have a well-rounded character like this one, or you can choose to specialize on a particular area so that in the pink ones, for example, you're reducing the cost of traveling around the board. So you might put a whole bunch of cards just in one spot. But remember, if I'm taking these pink missions, I'm also placing a cube on the pink hexes of that mini map as well. And those are the areas that I'm going to control later on in the game. So you've got this combination of worker placement and engine building that's allowing all of your actions to become more powerful. But what skills are you developing when you play this game? Of course, if you are planning ahead and trying to tackle things in an organized way and working towards building up your skills or building those life paths so that you can specialize in a certain area, if you're budgeting and managing resources, those are all examples of executive functioning skills. The ability to work towards a goal, planning ahead and being organized, and budgeting are all examples of executive functioning skills. But you've also got, because you've got this mini map that you're playing pieces onto, and you're trying to plan, where am I going to put those tubes? Where am I going to place my cubes in order to have a majority control around them? It's also a bit of a visual spatial game, because you're not just planning how to develop your character, but you're planning, where are things going to go? How am I spatially going to work this so that I can have control of the areas that I want to on the board? Final thoughts about Cytress. Well, this is, it's got that science fiction cyberpunk theme, and I used to love those William Gibson books back in the day. I think I have one on my Kindle and I haven't even read yet. So I'm a William Gibson fan. I like those cyberpunk stories, and I used to read them more than I do now. You've got that combination of worker placement and engine building, and those are two mechanisms that I enjoy playing. So this combines both of those, but I would say that this is probably the most personal engine builder I think that I've ever played. You play a game like Viticulture and you're building up your vineyard. You play other kinds of worker placement games, you're building something, but in this one, you're building up this rebel leader, this character, and it almost feels like a role-playing game, sort of, because you're advancing skills. You're not improving the kinds of grapes that are going in your vineyard, but you're advancing your skills. You're creating a life path, so it's almost like a story. You're doing these different missions, and maybe your gang is going to specialize in a certain kind of criminal activity, but it is a really personal engine building game, and I did like that portion of it. The table presence on this thing is also incredible. It is a bit of a table hog, but you've got that big Stratos board that reminded me in some ways of the Evertree from Everdell. The only issue, I think, with that board is that the final version of the game is going to have a really sturdy board, because the way it's designed in the prototype is that you flip it over. These levels flip over. I'm not going to pull it up again because I'll knock everything down, but the levels flip over depending on the number of players. So you've got to take it apart and put it back together with certain sides facing up. And I think that's going to increase the wear and tear on this thing. And in fact, in the prototype, it was a little bit bendy at the top while I was assembling everything after the game came in that delivery. So with Everdell, with Kabuto Sumo, which both have these big 3D pieces that are really cool when you're playing with them, I've left those pieces together. I've got a little space on the shelf where my Evertree sits, and it's always together because I didn't want that wear and tear putting it together and taking it apart. It's possible the design might change, right? You might wind up not having to flip the pieces over. The reason why you flip them is that with smaller play counts, you don't want to have too many. You get extra resources for being the first one to get to a certain level on that board, and there's only a certain number of those spaces for a 2-player game. There's more for a 3 or 4 or 5-player game, so you flip it, but they might change the design so that you've just got color-coded spaces or some other way of showing that there's only a certain number of spaces based on player count. So the wear and tear on that Stratos structure is something that might affect the longevity of your game. It is enjoyable to block players on that board and to try and take control on that mini map, right? The spatial part of the game was kind of a fun extra element, I think, that added something different maybe to a typical worker placement, because those cubes stay on the board throughout the game until you replace them with a tube, and then nothing else can go in a hex with a tube on it. I think, though, it would work better with more than 2 players. Now, we played this game at a 2-player count, and we had fun with the theme and building up those characters, and we would kind of make up stories about what we were doing. But with only 2 people on that map, we could sort of work just in our corners and build up lots of control there. I think with 3 or 4 players, it could become a bit more chaotic and allow more strategy really to be required to manage that mini map. So I think it plays better probably with a higher play count than just with 2. But that in a nutshell is Cytress. I will put information about the Kickstarter campaign as soon as it's available to me. That will go in the show notes below the video. If you have any questions or comments, if you have a favorite cyberpunk book, I'd like to know about it. You can leave those in the comments section below the video, or you can email me at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will go, and the previous ones are up there already. Brains on Games is the Twitter handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, so we're all over the place. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.